We're not here to do like Jewish slash Catholic slash Protestant geography, but to talk about what's going on in the legal system in this country. And you are sort of so equipped to talk to us about that. And I'm really happy that you're here. I'm sort of new to Substack, but I think we just are supposed to have a conversation. And if anyone has a question for Joyce, and wants to know something, please just chime in because that's the beauty of having this interactive platform. And I wanted to kind of ask you the big picture, Joyce. Should I actually tell everyone who you are? I think most people know, but
Sure.
just as a reminder, Joyce is a former U.S. attorney. She's a law professor. Where do you teach law, Joyce?
I teach at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Roll Tide.
Roll Tide. And she's also a legal analyst for MSNBC and NBC. She co hosts two podcasts, one called Sisters in Law and Cafes Insider. And you've said you believe being a citizen is the most important work any of us can do. A key part of our role is to educate ourselves and stay informed. I couldn't agree with you more, Joyce. And that's why I think it's so helpful to talk to people like you who can really synthesize and distill what's happening in the legal system because I think it's hard if you're not a lawyer. And when I was on the Today Show, I was married to my husband, Jay, a lawyer, and I used to always ask him questions about that. And he'd explain it. And I'd say, can you talk in sound bites, please? It's too complicated. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about all this. You know, when you look, take a step back, Joyce, though, kind of the big picture, what do you think in terms of the way our legal system and at almost every level is being challenged and probably threatened by this current administration?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot, right? That's a big question. And as you say, it doesn't really lend itself to sound bites, which has been the big challenge, frankly, of being on network television and cable television and trying to talk about it in a comprehensible way, which is one of the reasons I love Substack Live and welcome. I know it's your second day here, and I hope any of my readers, I write the Civil Discourse Substack. I hope if you guys are here that you'll follow Katie too, because lots to look forward to. Um, this is an important conversation. And I'll tell you my takeaway from the last 10 years watching, following the Trump administration, writing about it, talking to people, not just in my community, but all over the world, all over the country. My takeaway is that people are very smart. And if they have good information, accurate information, you cannot pull the wool over their eyes. And so the whole fight for democracy and for our legal system surrounds this question of how do people get accurate information in an era where we live with a lot of misinformation, disinformation, even efforts by the current occupant of the White House just to completely, bomb the zone with stuff that isn't true, that's designed to make people believe what he wants them to believe without understanding what's going on. And so I think the starting place for the conversation we need to have about understanding our government is surprisingly simple. We have a constitution. We have a rule of law. We have been had the luxury of taking them for granted for many years. Now we're being forced to re-educate ourselves as American citizens and understand why they're important. And I'll start with this, the rule of law, pretty words that lawyers say. I talk about them a lot with my law students. There's real content there. We have a rule of law that means we have a legal system where the laws are written. People know in advance what the laws are and what the rules of the road are. And that doesn't just mean we have constitutional rights like due process and equal protection, incredibly important things. It also means people can do business in this country with certainty. You can buy a house or you can start a business because you understand what the rules around that environment are. In the criminal sphere, we understand what conduct is criminal and we may not engage in because there are clear written rules. When you have a president who wants to erode that by engaging in, I'll say whimsical, but that's way too nice of a word, whimsical behavior that's meant to punish his enemies and reward his friends, that undercuts the whole rule of law. And we see the chaos swirling around Harvard in court today. Businesses, law firms, tariffs, people trying to figure out what in this world is
Pardons.
stable, right? That's why this rule of law stuff is so important for all of our daily lives.
It seems like of course, we've heard about Steve Bannon's goal to flood the zone, and you talk about if they have access to accurate information. And I think that's the big problem in this country. A lot of people are listening to news sources that are basically propaganda arms of the administration.
Mhm.
And so I think and then they think if people are being factual, and I've talked to Jim Acosta about this yesterday, that they're somehow biased because they're calling out what the Trump administration is doing. But I'd love to ask you some questions, Joyce, about some of the recent things that have happened. Number one, the pardons of the Chrisleys and some of these other individuals who are clearly it's a quid pro quo for loyalty and support of the Trump administration. I quoted a lawyer yesterday saying it was unprecedented and clearly a distortion of what pardons are all about. Can you explain what's wrong with the way President Trump is pardoning some of these individuals in exchange for either their financial support or loyalty tests of some kind?
Yeah, Trump's pardons are very troubling, but I think we should be honest about this. There have been questions about individual pardons issued by other presidents, right?
Right.
Notoriously, on the way out the door, Bill Clinton pardoned Mark Rich, a liberal financier who had donated to his campaign. And there were questions about that, as there should have been. What is unusual in the Trump administration is that they are flooding the zone. I'll use Bannon's word, pardon after pardon. Trump never saw a politician convicted of public corruption charges that he didn't want to pardon, right? He pardoned Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich in his first term just yesterday. He pardoned a couple more, Connecticut's former governor, a congressman, same sorts of
Eric
public
Adams
corruption.
of New York.
Exactly. I mean, didn't even have to go to trial and face conviction, right? Eric Adams' prosecution kneecapped before it fully got off the ground. These are not merit-based pardons. And Katie, let me tell you, I spent 25 years at DOJ. I worked closely with the pardon attorney's office for the last 8 of those years, really even longer than that, because there's a process where for every person, it used to be every person who asked for a pardon, there was a file that was worked up, and prosecutors, victims, judges were all consulted. And the pardon attorney would make recommendations, and then the White House counsel would go into the president and they would talk about who merited a pardon. Pardons are meant for justice and for mercy in unusual cases. I had a case, and I think this is a great example, where a guy was sentenced wrongly. The federal judge made a mistake in the calculation. Nobody in probation caught it. As the sitting US attorney, one of my appellate lawyers brought it to me and said, "Look, this guy is going to serve more time than he should." And the way that was handled was through the pardon process, with President Obama signing that pardon. Sometimes there are people who are serving longer sentences than in more modern times we think they should be. The crack cocaine defendants who had been sentenced to really long, I mean, like 30, 40-year sentences. And there came a time where Congress fixed that for new cases, but the older cases still languished. And people's sentences were commuted to be more commensurate with our sense of what was appropriate.
Hmm.
That's what pardons are supposed to be used for. But the Supreme Court has told Donald Trump he doesn't face criminal prosecution for any official acts he engages in. And that means he's free to issue these loyalty pardons, however we want to characterize them, for whoever catches his attention.
So, you talked about controversial pardons in the past, like Mark Rich, and there were other presidents, as you mentioned, where people looked askance at some of their decisions to pardon people. But in your view, as I understand what you're saying, Joyce, this is next level.
It's maybe next level by about 3 or 4 levels. It is open season on pardons for people who are willing to show loyalty to Donald Trump, not what the constitutional pardon power is intended for.
Let's talk about the other sort of things that are in the news, and then I want to talk some big picture things. Tell us about this panel that decided to overrule the tariffs because it's somewhat complicated. You can't really keep up with what's going on with tariffs. That's why I think so many businesses are struggling because they can't even plan because they don't know which way is up on any given day. And tell me about that decision. And then I want to ask you about something in the quote unquote big, beautiful bill that is hidden that may
Yeah.
allow Donald Trump and the rest of the administration to ignore some of these judicial rulings. But can you start with the ruling about by the three judge panel?
So, this is the equivalent of a federal trial court. We have sort of, or rather, of a sort of a specialty court setting, not the normal courts that people are used to thinking about. And so, this is a decision that is emblematic of this administration's entire approach to doing unprecedented stuff like these tariffs. Trump doesn't feel constrained by the constitutional assessment of power to the different branches of government, right? I mean, it's pretty clear in the Constitution. Certain powers are assigned to Congress. Trump has felt very free to go in and raid those, spending power in large part. And the argument here is that a president does not have the power to impose these kind of tariffs without going through an appropriate process. And so that's what we're seeing the challenge in the courts center on. You know, Trump and his folks believe in something called the unitary executive theory that says that the president has a lot more power than modern day American presidents have assumed. And so this is an entire part of that movement. And on the one hand, the tariffs are this bizarre little, I'm not an economist, right? But it's this bizarre little exercise in upsetting markets and Trump's claim that he's going to be able to right size those markets in Americans' favor. On the other hand, it's really this big issue about constitutional structure, how our government works, where the checks and balances are, what a president can do on their own. Constitution says presidents can issue pardons all day long. They don't have to ask anyone for permission. Tariffs are an entirely different issue where there are some checks. But the one thing that I'll say is that during his first administration, Trump did some tariffs in the steel industry, and on appeal, there was a sense that what he did was appropriate, an appropriate exercise of his powers. I haven't had a chance to study the opinions yet side by side enough to figure out how that lines up. I think that more to come on tariffs, right? We'll see whether the courts will ultimately disallow this.
Well, it sounds like I guess it'll be appealed, right? It already has been
Yeah.
appealed by the Trump administration. But there's sort of a larger issue, and someone said, please don't call it the big, beautiful bill. Message received, the bill, or the, and I'm not going to call it the big, ugly bill. I'm just going to call it the bill. But there's something hidden in the bill that Mike Flood, who's a congressman, where's Mike Flood from again? Nebraska had there were a couple of town meetings and his constituents were angry about something in this bill that he said he didn't even know was in it, Joyce. And it's basically something that limits the power of federal judges to hold people in contempt, potentially shielding President Trump and members of his administration from the consequences of violating court orders. This is a huge, huge deal. And if this bill passes, this is going to have incredible ramifications for the power of the judiciary to stop the Trump administration. Can you elaborate on that for us, Joyce?
So, look, the goal of this provision, which was snuck, really snuck into this bill, Flood claimed that he did not see it before he voted for the bill. That seems unlikely to me because it's been a subject of conversation among folks ever since this bill went into circulation. But be that as it may, it's a provision that would prevent federal judges from holding the government in contempt when the government doesn't follow a judge's order. And of course, we're not stupid, right? We all get the context. We're all watching the deportation cases. We know that the government is on a collision course with the federal judiciary because they are just this far away from being an open and flagrant violation of judges' orders in some of those cases. They've tried to walk a really fine line. My personal sense is that there are several federal judges who are just about out of patience And I know a lot of people who are listening are really frustrated by the fact that no judge has yet taken the plunge and held the government in contempt. But I think the situation with this provision in the bill illustrates why the courts are handling this just right, although frustratingly slow, because what they need to do is build a record that demonstrates that the government is not in compliance step by step, patiently. That's what judges are very good at, so that if a federal judge somewhere finally holds the government in contempt and issues the order, it won't be a close call. It'll be very, very clear cut. This provision would try to strip the judges of the ability to do that. Look, it would have to be litigated, and I'm not so sure that federal courts, even the Supreme Court, are going to undercut their own powers and sign off on the constitutionality of a provision like this, which is arguably not constitutional. There's a good argument there, but this is the political climate we live in,
I
where
was
the
going to say the Supreme Court doesn't
yeah.
have anything to say about this, Joyce. This is going to be decided by the Senate, right?
Well, yes and no, Katie. I mean, the Senate still has to vote on this bill. I think that looks like a pretty good check, right? I think a couple of Republicans will cross over and join hands with Democrats on this. But let's say that they don't. There will be challenges of this provision in courts because an ingrained part of our system is that the courts get to pass on the constitutionality of laws that Congress adopts. And so we'll be off to the races in court for a couple of years. At a minimum, I think we would expect to see this provision enjoined so it couldn't go into effect while that litigation was underway.
So you talk about forming a track record. Pardon my ignorance, Joyce, about the whole legal system. Are you talking like various cases would be put together where the administration did not follow the rule of law and were called out by judges of all, at all different levels, appellate courts, district judges, federal judges, and they'd have to show examples of how the administration basically ignored their rulings?
So it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's actually sort of the storyline that the courts look to develop. But lawyers, we call it building a record. And I'm an old appellate lawyer. I'm used to defending or arguing against these decisions made by district judges on appeal. And when I would go into the appellate court, the first part of my brief would be sort of a statement of the facts, telling the appellate court, here's everything that happened in the court below. If I'm the appellate lawyer, not the lawyer for the government, the lawyer for the other side, in one of these cases that ultimately results in a contempt finding, I want to be able to go into the appellate court and say, we tried. We tried so hard. At every step of the way, the judge gave the government the opportunity to comply, and they didn't. And you want to go step by step in your case. How very helpful to say, unless you think this is just a mistake, Your Honors, here are four other cases where the government did the same thing. This is an administration that wants a confrontation with the courts, and that's why we're here. I mean, I think that's a compelling sort of a setting to be in for enforcing the contempt. People have been debating, right? Do the courts really have the ability and the authority to enforce contempt? And that's an entirely different sort of a question. But yes, there are tools and there are mechanisms. And we've seen early signs, and I think this is important, from Republicans in the Senate who, at times when there have been criticism of judges or suggestions that judges should be impeached for their rulings, they've sort of dipped in on social media, on Twitter, just to say, no, that's not how our system works. And I mean, the question is the Republican Party willing to blow up the entire legal system for Donald Trump? Or do they want there to be a system for us to continue on with at the end of this administration?
I hope that as people recognize the danger of something like this being included in this bill, the public sentiment will rise up and pressure some of these senators to not approve it. I mean, there's a lot of other terrible things in this bill in terms of Medicaid and health and SNAP and all kinds of things. But I think there might be a groundswell and it might influence senators because I want to take it to the worst case scenario. Let's say this bill passes, right? And this part of the bill is, passes along with it. What exactly does that mean for any government official, not just Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, right? My expectation, though, I don't think that we should be too alarmist here. My expectation is that within about 30 seconds of this bill passing, there will be folks in court getting it enjoined, this provision from going into effect. But let's just assume the worst case scenario. That doesn't happen, it goes into effect. And suddenly we have something that the founding fathers um, put so much effort into preventing. We have an all powerful executive. You know, you can call it a monarch or an autocrat or a dictator, whatever you want, but we would have a president that could control the direction of the country with no checks and balances.
No
And
guardrails at all.
I mean, that's absolutely true, right? The Constitution is a document that explicitly imposes guardrails. Three branches of government, each with their own power, each to act as a check on some form of factionalism in one of the other branches, where people who didn't have the best interests of the whole country at heart took over government for their own behalf. If you like to study history, and I'm sort of nerdy, so I do, in the Federalist Papers, Federalist 10 is all about this notion of factionalism, of dangerous groups that arise in the country who want to sort of take all the power in government and use it to benefit themselves and not to benefit all of us. Because really, what we're doing as Americans is we give up some of our own power to government because we believe government will act on our behalf. So when Donald Trump does this, you know, this provision in this bill, sure, it's just one little provision, but this is a fundamental breach of the trust that the American people have placed in their government for almost 250 years. We cannot be afraid to call this out. And if you've got Republican senators and congresspeople like I do, you should call them. We should have expectations for them that they will put country over party in a moment like this. And I know it's tempting just to say, you know, my senator is Tommy Tuberville. He ain't going to do anything about this, so I'm not going to bother. That's not the case. You need to call these folks and confront them, have conversations with their staff members, insist that they engage with their community. This is a basic issue about our form of government.
And I think people don't realize. I remember I did a documentary on gun violence and I interviewed Mark and Kelly and Gabby Giffords. And they were saying when Gabby was a member of Congress that people really do pay attention to the people who are calling and lodging complaints. I do you think this oh wait, I wanted to ask you another question. I know these aren't supposed to be that long, but I just have a few more things to ask you, Joyce, because I could stay on this for 2 hours and I know you probably don't have time. And you're writing
No,
a
I'm
book.
I'm good. This is so much more fun than sound bites, and you ask all the right questions.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. One of the questions that I have been trying to figure out is this level of corruption in the Trump administration. The fact that the family has personally gained in the first 3 months $3 billion of personal wealth. The fact that they're negotiating all these things with the Qataris, that they're doing things with Saudi Arabia, they're building things here, building things there, as he is running the country and watching, you know, cable news. I don't know what he's doing at this time, but how can that be allowed under the law to use the position of president of the United States to rake in all this money and the meme coin? I mean, it just goes on, and it's so grotesque to me. I just don't get why it's allowed to happen.
You know, I'm a former federal prosecutor, and if this was a member of Congress or a senator engaging in this kind of behavior, I would have an investigation opened and be well on the way to determining whether I had sufficient evidence to prosecute a case, because none of this is right. I mean, this is just a fundamental violation of how our country is supposed to work. I don't want to weigh in on the specifics of criminal law because when you decide whether to prosecute someone, it's very evidence based, but there is plenty here for a full fledged investigation to be ongoing, except for the fact that the United States Supreme Court, and I think something that will go down as one of the worst decisions they've ever made in Trump versus United States, gives Trump this broad immunity that we talked about before. And there is some wiggle room in that case, right? That case is about a president engaging in official acts. And I'm pretty sure that issuing a meme coin on the eve of your inauguration and raking in money from people who want to have access to you, that looks like what I would call a pay to play scheme for a politician, right? If you want access to my government, to my administration, you've got to pay for it. That's just one example of the sort of grift and corruption we see in this administration. Maybe there's room there to prosecute someone for doing that. But Pam Bondi as Attorney General and this Justice Department will not go there. The only small piece of good news is that the federal statute of limitations on crimes is 5 years from the time that they occur, or if there's a conspiracy from the last event in the cover up. And so, if God willing, the American people see fit to change course in 3.5 years and tracking whatever we are to the next presidential election, there is a chance, that this conduct could be right sized and
Or
prosecuted.
during the midterms, Joyce, right? If the Democrats win seats in the midterms, they could launch an investigation, right?
Yeah, I mean, we know that in our system, because we've all lived through this, that there are two different sides of that equation. There's the criminal side, which is the Justice Department, the political side, which is an impeachment sort of a setting. And so, here's the deal. We screwed up both of those the first time, right? Impeachment didn't work times two. The Biden administration took a couple of shots at Trump and missed. The question is whether the second time over we could do it right. Could he be impeached and forever removed from the prospect of holding office? Might there be criminal prosecutions that would hold him accountable for criminal conduct? I mean, I think a lot of people have lost their faith in government. I will tell you, I have not. I'm eternally optimistic about this notion that we can do better. And I think having learned the lessons of the past, there has to be hope that people will come into government who will act decisively, who will meet the challenge of the moment, who will do the right thing. But boy, those are going to need to be some smart, courageous people, and we should all think about that very carefully when we go to the polls for the midterms.
Well, the DOJ has changed significantly. I've talked to a lot of lawyers over the past several years, and I think the DOJ has always been, correct me if I'm wrong, Joyce, accused of being politicized, right? In some way, shape, or form. Although people accuse Merrick Garland of being so conscious to not, give the appearance of being political that he perhaps moved too slowly on some things. But again, we talk about gradations of corruption or inappropriate actions. And this DOJ is really beyond the pale in terms of how it's conducting itself as a supposedly apolitical institution.
Yeah, look, I mean, I have a very stark view on this. DOJ was never a political institution. I was hired during a Republican administration. I served in a senior leadership role in my office during the Bush administration. In my office, we had people who were all across the board on their political views, and it just never mattered. We
But
checked in
but
at the
but
door.
but wait, sorry to interrupt, but I just think, Joyce, what about, Ed Meese or even RFK, when he was Attorney General, when John F. Kennedy was president? I mean, there was the appearance of, was there not, of a Department of Justice that was a little too cozy, if you will, with the executive branch?
So I would answer that question this way. That's, of course, that very top tier, right? That
Yeah.
top level of the
Yeah, I'm not
department.
talking about the career
Yeah.
lawyers.
A- And that's always the tension, right? There is a post Watergate tradition in the Justice Department that very carefully limits contacts between the White House and the Justice Department. And the rubric, the way that this goes is it's okay to engage on matters of policy, right? The Attorney General is supposed to talk with the president. The president says, this is my top priority, public corruption and white collar crime or whatever, and the Attorney General implements it. What's not supposed to happen is conversation about individual cases. The president isn't supposed to decide or direct who gets prosecuted and who gets a pass. And so that's really where the rubber meets the road. And like you say, there are allegations. Ed Meese, of course, went to prison. There was, people believed that whether there was actual impropriety, there was the appearance of impropriety when President Kennedy had his brother in the attorney general's role. But here's the important thing: the trajectory of the Justice Department until this administration, maybe until the first Trump administration, was always to try to do it better, because we understood that the public's confidence in our integrity was the only thing that made us go as an organization. So there was a sincere consideration going on at the highest levels of the department, Republican or Democrat in office. How do we do it better? How do we do the right thing for the right reasons in the right way? And that's the sharp departure in this administration. There is no commitment to doing the right thing for the right reasons. Instead, there's Pam Bondi holding a press conference in front of the White House. I mean, I can't tell you, in DOJ circles, it was so shocking to see an attorney general as her first move giving an interview on Fox News with the White House as her backdrop. That is not who the Justice Department is supposed to be. And you can tell I'm getting myself all worked up. But let me tell you, as a sitting United States attorney, I understood that it was so important for us in all cases to set aside our bias and our connections, who our friends were, who we went to temple or church or mosque with, and to think only about the facts and the law. That's what the American people expect the Justice Department to do. That's what it has to deliver.
Our mutual friend Jenny Durkin wanted me to ask you about all the people leaving DOJ. There's so many career lawyers who have left or been fired for really ridiculous reasons, like the woman I interviewed who refused to give Mel Gibson his gun
Yeah.
rights
The head of
back.
the pardons office.
Right, who because because of his history of domestic violence, and she was basically fired
Mhm.
for making that determination. But how concerned are you that all the good lawyers are going to leave?
It's really deeply concerning. In my office, I mean, I ran sort of what's called a large office, but not one of the biggest offices in the country. There's small sized offices, medium sized offices, different offices all over the country. And we used to say, when it came to new political appointees coming on board, well, we're bees. We be here when they come, we be here when they go. And our view was that our job was to continue to do our jobs and to uphold our oaths no matter what happened. And I'll tell you frankly that during the Bush administration, we lost some people who were concerned about the politicization of the Justice Department when it came to light that United States attorneys had been fired because they weren't carrying the White House's water. And there were some people close to retirement who just said, I'm out, I can't do this, right? There were also a lot of people who said there is never a time where it's more important for people who believe in justice, not politics, to stay in the Justice Department. And those folks stuck it out and moved on to happier times. This is a tough time for people in the Justice Department. And my heart goes out to folks who are being asked to work on cases that they do not believe in. It is not your job as an assistant United States attorney to set priorities. That's the president and the attorney general's job. And if you're asked to work on, whatever the flavor of the month is, deadbeat daddy cases, and if you think that's not a great allocation of DOJ resources, well, then you're free to leave, but you have to work the cases that are priorities. When you are being asked to engage in revenge prosecutions, that's a whole different sort of an issue. And my heart breaks for people who are talented, committed professionals who are leaving their jobs. I hope as many of them as possible will try to stick it out.
Yeah, but as you said, it can be very hard, especially if they're doing things that are they're being asked to do things that are totally antithetical to their principles and their, moral
And look,
compass.
at some point, you just can't do that. At one point, I had a U.S. attorney to ask me to file a motion that just wasn't the right thing to do. And so I sort of said to my husband, be prepared for me to get fired. And I had a conversation with this US attorney and said, look, I just can't sign this. It's not the right thing for us to do. And fortunately, they agreed and backed down. But sometimes you've got to be able to have those conversations with your boss as a line prosecutor. In this administration, they simply don't care. In fact, on her first day in office, Attorney General Bondi issued guidance that said, you must go into court or take any position that you're told to Otherwise, you'll be fired. So they have made it very clear where they are on those ethics sorts of issues.
I mean, it's really disgusting. I mean, and can you imagine if Matt Gates had gotten that job? And then Pam Bondi, I think, is just as bad. But in comparison to Gates, I think they threw him out as the sacrificial lamb so they could get her in. But
Yeah.
I don't know. What do I know? I wanted to ask you about the immunity from prosecution Supreme Court decision. And I know I'm preparing for this interview, Jack Goldsmith, who I think is a professor at Harvard, right?
Harvard. Yeah.
Speaking of Harvard, he has said, quote, the opinion amounted to perhaps the most consequential disquisition. What does that mean?
I don't
Disquisition.
know. What is that? I
Okay,
don't
we're gonna have
remember
to
that
look
from
that
this
up.
piece.
Ever, if anybody watching this knows what DISQUISITION means, can you just tell us in the comments? Ever on the law of the presidency? You basically echoed those sentiments. Do you think anyone on the Supreme Court, maybe this is a stupid question, regrets that decision?
I have been asking people that question in interviews. I interviewed last week for my podcast, for the Insider podcast. I interviewed Cecilia Wang, who's one of the ACLU lawyers handling the deportation cases, but she also does voting rights and election law. And she argued one of the cases that's in the Supreme Court this term, the Louisiana redistricting case. And so I asked her, do you think that they regret it? And she sort of hedged, like I'm about to with you, and then gave the same answer that I'm going to give you, which is John Roberts has got to be, getting up in the middle of the night and just thinking, okay, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought we were writing an opinion that would get us through the end of the Trump administration and on into the future. And little did I know that it was going to rebound and I was going to be living with the consequences maybe for the rest of my life. I mean, look, my belief about that opinion was that if Kamala Harris had won the election, and if the litigation against Trump, the criminal prosecutions had been ongoing, I think the Supreme Court would have narrowed it because that opinion says that a president is immune for his official acts. And as we talked about with the meat coin, there's also, presidents also act in their personal capacity, right? And when a president is engaged in running his campaign, electioneering, that's not official acts. I think we would have seen the Supreme Court carve out a scope for prosecution there. But of course, they can't now because Trump won the election. Here we are. If they narrow that opinion, that's going to be 4 years, 5 years down the road. I got to believe that they have regrets.
Disquisition means a long essay or treatise. Thank you, everyone who looked that up for us. We appreciate
Very
it.
grateful.
Do you think they would ever, uh, you're saying they could reevaluate that, but it's going to be, why couldn't they do it sooner than in 4+ years?
Yeah, they can't just take it up on their own. There has to be a case and controversy in front of them for them to make a decision.
Well,
So it
aren't
would
there enough? Man, I mean,
Well, but there's not a criminal prosecution, right? DOJ dismissed its prosecutions. Who knows what's going on in Georgia? Um, the reality is another criminal, I think a federal prosecution, to be honest, of Trump would have to come before the court for them to change that rule, or not really to change it as much as to narrow it and to say, oh no, you crazy people, you thought that we meant much more than what we meant, but really we meant that there was this more limited, form of immunity, not this global immunity that you've all taken for granted that was what we were talking about. That would require a federal prosecution and the issue raised and percolating its way up from the lower courts to the Supreme Court before the justices could decide it. In other words, we're really talking about pie in the sky here. And in many ways, this opinion, this case is the law, and it's dangerous law. It has damaged the country. The justices, I mean, it's still shocking to me. I saw no way that a majority of the court would rule that a president could use SEAL Team 6 to execute a political opponent for retribution and walk away with no consequence. I mean, because that's really what that decision says. I thought, no way will this Supreme Court rule for that. It will be 7-2 against Trump. And I was dead wrong. And I think that tells us maybe a lot about naivete, but also a lot about this court.
I'm going to let you go because I've taken so much of your time. I know you're busy doing a lot of things, including writing a new book about democracy. And so you're deep into that. By the way, you all will have to tell me how to get rid of trolls on this feed because I'm new to this platform and I don't really know how to do it. We just had a few. Most of the everybody watching has been very smart and thoughtful and helpful. And thank you all so much for joining us. Joyce, I would love to do this again. I'd love to talk to you about some of the things that are happening with deportations, with the rights of immigrants, with what's happening at Harvard. And there's so much to talk about, and you really break it down in such a clear, understandable way. So thank you for doing this with me. And it's a real treat to finally meet you.
Thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Let's do it again and make our friend Jenny Durkin join us.
Okay, that would be great. I'll tell her you said hi. And
It's a
Henry,
date.
too.
Sounds, oh my gosh, that would be so much fun. Okay,
All
that's a
right.
date.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
y'all. Bye.
Bye.